guard my feet while I run this race. Guard my feet while I run this race.
Welcome to our newest Be the Bridge 101 series, hosted by Mount Calvary Lutheran Church here in Excelsior, Minnesota. I'm Heidi Bush, Director of Outreach at Mount Calvary, and from wherever you're joining us today, we are glad that you're here. God calls us to love one another, which means not just acknowledging our differences, but also fully appreciating that the experiences of our neighbors are not the same as ours. Growing up in an outer suburb of the Twin Cities, my life experiences were not culturally diverse. Although my brother is adopted from South Korea, my neighborhood, school, and town were predominantly white. I grew up with a relatively small perspective on the experiences of people that didn't look like me. My understanding of racism was learned through textbook entries on the civil rights movement, and that was over a long time ago. Good thing they figured that out, right? And as a young adult, I was confronted about my ignorance. I remember being confused and frustrated. Why was this person so angry at me for something I wasn't aware even existed? Be the Bridge is the first racial reconciliation material I've experienced that's meant to be personal without being judgmental, educational without being accusatory. It's meant to provide a space for white people to explore challenging concepts and perspectives. Each week, you'll receive a pre-recorded video hosted by Pastor Dave Olson and others, which will give you a more scriptural connection to the weekly reading. We hope that this video content, along with discussion questions, will enrich your small group time. Again, thank you for being here. This work is important, and we are happy that we can be on this journey together.
Welcome to Cross Paths and session 1 of our study on the resource Be the Bridge 101 by Latasha Morrison. I'm so excited we have over 100 people signed up for this opening session and a small army of Mount Calvary staff in the wings handling the technical and logistic details. So I'm so thankful that you are joining us for this very important study. Now, typically, Cross Paths involves a direct study of the Bible with an emphasis on allowing the Bible to speak with its own voices. Now, in addition to being voices that have guided and inspired faithful witness and brought grace and gospel into our everyday lives and conversations, they've also been voices that through the centuries have sometimes been silenced or interpreted in order to fit the agenda of the reader or the interpreter, to support systems created to preserve the status quo. These are voices sometimes sought out to support opinions already formed or ignored when they don't. Now this fall, while we are working with the Be the Bridge 101 resource, we're also going to be listening to the voice of Scripture, the voice of Jesus speaking of God's vision for human community, for relationships, and for the challenge to us to be participants in bringing that vision to life. Now, some months ago here in Minneapolis, a video and the very public killing of George Floyd brought many of us into conversation about racial justice. In these past months of conversations about racial reconciliation, reflection, and change, there have been very passionate debates, protests, riots, misunderstandings, deep emotions and convictions, accusations, defenses. There have been voices demanding to be heard and efforts to silence them. We've seen violence and hatred complicating the path forward and in some cases deepening the divide. I believe Be the Bridge does a brilliant job from a faith perspective to lay the groundwork for us to be listening, to be learning, to be reflecting and reconciling. It helped me when I worked through the materials with other staff members to listen both to the voices of others and to the voices within myself, for the purpose of being one who can build bridges from faith. And with, as Pastor Brenda preached about recently, preaching with a generous grace. Now, rarely has it ever been more obvious that I didn't know what I didn't know. Now, that may not be true. You maybe are more aware that I don't know what I don't know. But the work of reconciliation is not a sidebar of Christ's church. It's our first order of business. It's God's work. It's our hearts. It's our hands. So tonight we begin. We are committed here. We are hopeful. In fact, we are insistent that we provide in this place a safe place for all voices, for all opinions, where our conversations can be held with respect and create trust. Some years ago, we read a book together written by a Jewish rabbi titled, "You Don't Have to Be Wrong for Me to Be Right." Rabbi Hirschfeld wrote that the sharing of ideas and faiths and opinions doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. But when we share them in an atmosphere of respect and esteem, they can lead us to a better understanding, a broader vision, a way towards spiritual growth. More recently, we've been gathering as a congregation under the conviction that for everyone born, there should be a place at God's table. We've asked, how big is our us, and what do we mean when we say we? We've expressed our belief that God has called and compelled us to draw the circle wide and wider still. And frankly, if we're going to make of these more than clever catchphrases, pleasant sentiments, you and I have some serious work. We as a congregation have serious work and change to do. From the book of Genesis to the closing chapters of the Revelation to John, God's intentions are crystal clear. Human life, in fact, all created life belongs to God. And from the beginning, we as humans have strayed from God's intentions by abusing, by mistreating and breaking relationship with each other. In God's call to Abram and Sarai in Genesis 12, God calls them forward to become a great nation, a blessed nation whose name is made great. Now, they're chosen not to be superior or better than, but great for the purpose of being a blessing in the world, in order that all the families of the earth shall be blessed. To be chosen by God is not to be given an elite status or an elevated view of oneself in the world. To be chosen is to be purposed for representing the heart and the will of God in the world for all peoples. In the story of the Pentecost in Acts 2, the Spirit empowers the disciples to speak in numerous languages in order that they would become witnesses from Jerusalem to the ends of the earth. Witnesses of this inclusive gospel Jesus modeled and preached. And in Revelation 21, that grand conclusion, the vision of God is that people and nations from the four corners of the earth would stream into the new holy city. And of course, when you read Jesus, how he taught and modeled a relationship with God that crossed boundaries and borders, overcame barriers and prejudices, and took special care to listen to the voices of the ones silenced and the oppressed. We read of Jesus and we see how he drew circles wide and wider than most were comfortable accepting. He challenged systems that may have originated with the best of intentions, but which had grown rigid and self-serving, or become dominated and mispurposed by a statist elite. And the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 12 shared his vision of what God's people can be. That we're like a human body where differences in the parts, when joined together, work together for the glory of God, work together for the care of each other. To illustrate his point, Paul says the members of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. Those members of the body that we think less honorable, we clothe with greater honor. And our less respected members, we treat with greater respect, so that the members may have the same care for each other. In fact, if one part of that body suffers, we all suffer together with it. If one is honored, we all rejoice together with it. There's no question that voices are being and have been raised that say to us, we're suffering. We're tired of empty promises. We're tired of pleasant catchphrases and seeing no change. Voices saying enough is enough. Some months ago, I saw a photograph of a man holding a sign at a protest that read, "Sorry I'm late, but I had a lot to learn." And I knew immediately that was me. Now, it wasn't that I didn't have some of the information, and it wasn't because I hadn't heard the voices of some who said the system and the odds were stacked against them. But I realized that I'd placed the burden of proof and the job of educating me on the very people who had been oppressed. And when they stopped raising their voices and calling for my attention, I just went back to life as usual. I've decided that that needs to change for me. Now, when you read the introduction and the glossary of terms in preparation, I'm curious if you had some of the same reactions I did. What was your body telling you? Were you eager, sitting on the edge of your seat, eager to learn and hopeful that this might help you know the situation better? And that there was something that you could do that would make a difference? Or did you read mostly with a critical eye, looking for places where you could argue or poke holes, defend your position? Did you find yourself feeling defensive? Did you find the faith and the biblical witness helpful? Or did you tend to dismiss the Bible references as church talk? I was surprised. I was very discouraged the other day to read the results of a survey of white Christians about racial injustice. The survey was done by the Barna Group, who specialize in surveys around the intersection of faith and culture. They've conducted millions of interviews over the last couple decades. They are the gold standard when it comes to studies of church folk, and they're equally esteemed by traditions, both conservative or liberal. In a study published on September 15th, just a couple of weeks ago, they said that there are signs that the killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, and the shooting of Jacob Blake have sparked a nationwide conversation about racial justice. But in the church especially, it has not increased the sense of urgency to do something about it. But it has caused people within the church to double down on divides. The percentage of actively worshiping Christians who say that this country definitely has a race problem actually decreased from 46% to 43% in this last year. And maybe more alarming, the percentage of active Christian worshipers who say that race is not at all a problem increased from 11 to 19%. Now, among Black Christians, 81% say this country definitely has a race problem. When those surveyed were asked, how motivated are you to address racial injustice? In 2019, 20% of all adults, churchgoers, non-churchgoers, said they were unmotivated or not at all motivated, 20%. In 2020, the percentage increased to 28%, unmotivated, not at all motivated to talk about racial injustice. But here's the scary statistic. Among practicing Christians, actively worshiping Christians, the number of unmotivated increased from 19 to 30%. When I read the results of that survey, I was even more certain that we were on the right path when we chose to make Be the Bridge 101 our focus for this fall's Crosspaths. And as we are going to discuss in a future session, the sad truth is that when it has come to some of the major issues in our nation's history, such as slavery, treatment of Native Americans, the role of women, immigration, anti-Semitism, the Christian church in the U.S. has often been on the wrong side of history, siding with those more concerned about maintaining the status quo than being agents for the gospel of Jesus. Now, it doesn't have to be so. In fact, as I read scriptures, if any group of people ought to be incentivized and taught to value reconciliation and justice, hospitality and grace, inclusive and care, it ought to be us. It ought to be us reaching out to the vulnerable and the oppressed to make a difference. I think if any group is called to model humility, compassion, and a servant's heart, it's us. And when voices have called out for so long, and the historical record has been so conclusive that we've sought to first benefit from and then marginalize those we label other, we should be concerned. Think of the Chinese that we brought here to build our railroads, the Japanese we welcomed to grow our fishing industry, the Mexicans we embraced to harvest our fields, the Italians, the Irish, those abducted from Africa and the Caribbean to be forced into slavery. Native Americans offered one empty promise and paper-thin treaty after another, only to have that taken away. Our history is that human beings, God's people, have been viewed as economic assets and then discarded or marginalized as anxiety over those seen as other increased. Can we agree, even if we disagree on remedies and steps forward, can we agree we have a problem? There is a need to discuss racial injustice in this country. Can we agree that there should be, and we should be, having these conversations with each other, listening carefully to the voices of those who've suffered because of that injustice? Can we agree that it is wrong to consistently blame the victims and force them to name the problems and keep bringing them to our attention? Can we say, as followers of Jesus, that we're not afraid to read? We're not afraid to learn the historical truth, not afraid to learn about the contemporary costs of the racial injustices that have led to deaths and protests. In our fifth session, we will explore some of that history and how some of the systems put in place 400 years ago have evolved and are still influencing contemporary life and attitudes today. The problem today is not what some people say, that we're trying to rewrite history, but we're unwilling to examine how the rewriting of our history and the ignoring of those painful truths have perpetuated injustice, inequity, and our iniquity. If you haven't already done so, I hope you read the story about the birth of Be the Bridge 101 on page 24 of your materials. I don't think I could say it any better, any clearer, what our vision is for this study at Mount Calvary. So let me quote what Latasha Morrison wrote about her mission. She said, "Our mission is to inspire the church to have a distinctive and transformative response to racial division, to equip bridge builders to develop vision, skills, and hearts for racial unity, and to partner with existing organizations who have a heart for diversity, racial justice, restoration, and reconciliation." Now, I hope you came prepared for a conversation with each other in your small groups that's open, honest, humble, and respectful. I'm asking you to pay attention to how you engage. I'm sure through the years, others have given you feedback in the past on how you behave in a group. Do you listen to others as attentively as you want them to listen to you? Are you one known for talking too much and not allowing others a voice? Are you one who tends more to be silent and often go away wishing that you'd spoken up because you really did have something to say? Do you tend to enter conversations like this promoting a platform and certain that your view is superior to all others? I think the best and most effective moderator of yourself should be you. But we've provided facilitators who will help you if the need arises. I believe this conversation among your sisters and brothers of faith is an important step forward. The gospel calls forth an orientation of compassion, with the conviction that it is in the hearts that are transformed and not just the information dispensed that God's kingdom moves out into God's world. And as Caleb Rosado points out in one of the recommended readings for tonight, compassion goes far beyond sympathy or empathy to affect the change we hope to see. He writes, "In sympathy, there's sorrow for the other in need. But with sorrow, there's also a sense of distance, separation from the other, an I'm not like you type of response. And even though there's an emotional response in sympathy, the bridge of identification with the other has not been crossed. There's an emotional experience of social distance. And this is often the experience of bystanders." Secondly, he says, when there's empathy, empathy is not only sorrow, but it's also an identification with the other in need. In empathy, the person crosses that bridge of identification, enters into the emotional sphere of the other, identifies with the pain. The other senses this, knows that identification has taken place. This is what Paul meant by weeping with those who weep. But compassion. Jesus is all about compassion. And in compassion, there's not only sorrow, there's not only identification with the other in need, but there's also an involvement in action to meet the need. Your participation in this conversation over the next 7 weeks is not going to fix the problem of racial injustice. but I pray it will be part of transforming our hearts towards bringing the compassion of Jesus into the conversation, into the transformation, creating a new reformation as we build bridges of trust and respect that are long overdue. We may, some of us, be late in arriving and have an awful lot to learn. I want to thank you for showing up for this very important work.
For I don't want to run this race in vain.